Hello everybody, I know it's been a long time since I actually did one of these, but this is Michael Parenti, Blackshirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism. Michael Parenti, if you don't know who he is, he's a communist, and he was once close friends with Bernie Sanders until they fell out because Bernie Sanders voted in favour of the Yugoslav wars in the 90s. And this book came out in the 90s, not long after the fall of the Soviet Union. So it basically details how fascism was backed up by capitalist interests. So capitalist corporations, individuals and institutions financially backed fascists and Nazis and made a profit from it. So for instance, they gave out slave labour contracts to the camps and profited from the slave labour in the camps. They actually had plants and stuff. So for instance, Ford had a plant in Cologne, and any history buff such as myself will tell you that by the end of the war, with the Allied bombing campaign, Cologne was levelled. But the one building that was standing, which was quite surprising to me, I never knew this until I read this book, was the Ford weapons plant, which was providing the Nazis with weapons. But it was left standing because the Allied pilots had orders not to attack any building that was owned by Allied companies, so Western companies, American companies. And the Ford factory was so safe that citizens in Cologne were actually using it as an air raid shelter. And of course, I'd never disparage anybody kind of seeking safety from bombs. I'd never say that that's wrong. But the fact that they actually were able to use that as an air raid shelter and feel safe really says it all about who was protected during the fascist era. I busted out the old highlights. I've got some highlighted bits going on. But I find it quite interesting how in the very, very, very early pages of the book, page 5 even, he points out how the Social Democrats in Germany, during the rise of Hitler, they actually refused. The Communist Party of Germany offered them a coalition. When the Nazis were on the brink of coming to power, the Social Democrats refused an offer of kind of a partnership with the Communist Party to form a coalition to beat Nazism. So that really struck out for me, particularly in 2021 Britain, when we've got a Labour Party that refuses to work with leftists and is actively purging leftists, far leftists, from their party. That really struck out for me. So it says here, by 1930, most of the tycoons had concluded that the Weimar Republic no longer served their needs and was way too accommodating to the working class. They greatly increased their subsidies to Hitler, propelling the Nazi Party onto the national stage. So literally, the funds that Hitler needed to get the Nazi Party and the funds that the Nazi Party needed to get onto the national stage, to run their campaigns and their slogans and their propaganda, was provided by tycoons because they believed that the Weimar Republic was being too accommodating to the working class. German workers and farm labourers had won the right to unionise, the 8-hour day and unemployment insurance, but to revive profit levels, heavy industry and big finance wanted wage cuts for their workers and massive state subsidies and tax cuts for themselves. So that's exactly why they subsidised Hitler and subsidised Nazis. So here you go. So Feynman, in the first, one of the first elections that Hitler actually ran in, he actually lost. But in his campaign, Feynman argued that a vote for Hindenburg amounted to a vote for Hitler, and that Hitler would lead Germany into war. So he said, if you get this guy in power, he will lead us into war. And the bourgeois press, including the Social Democrats, denounced this view as Moscow-inspired. So again, we've got this red fear, this kind of McCarthyism. And actually, he talks about left McCarthyism. He coins this kind of term, left McCarthyism, where McCarthyism wasn't just the product of conservative Republican Americans, it's actually present in the left as well. So yeah, he talks about how huge amounts are made from secretly owned, well-connected businesses and from contracting out camp slave labour to industrial firms like IG Farben and Krupp. So, these people were actually profiting from slave labour during the fascist/Nazi era. Hitler got special rulings from the German tax office that allowed him to avoid paying income or property tax. Sound familiar? Yeah, it did to me as well. And then it talks about how human in the Nazi era, human attributes, including class status, are said to be inherited through blood. One's position in the social structure is taken as a measure of one's innate nature. Now, you may remember Britannia Unchained, that may be a book that rings a bell to you, actually written by several Conservative MPs who are currently serving, and in that they state that people are poor because it's in their nature. Poor people are poor because that's who they are, and it's innate. So that's scary. Here we go. So the Rockefeller family's Chase National Bank used its Paris office in Vichy, France to help launder German money to facilitate Nazi international trade during the war, and did so with complete impunity. So the banks, the corporations, the big bosses, the CEOs, the fat cats, actively, during the war, financed the Nazis to encourage trade, and they got away with it. So this was quite interesting. We all know about Operation Paperclip, right, where the Nazi scientists and the Nazi sort of administrators were brought over to America to work for the Americans. But here I've got highlighted, under the protection of US occupation authorities, the police, courts, military, security agents and bureaucracy remained largely staffed by those who had served the former fascist regimes or by their ideological recruits, as is true to this day. So, again, under the Americans, the bureaucrats, the security agents, the military officers, those kind of people kept their jobs, even though they'd served the Nazis. And then he goes on to say, when the communists took over East Germany, they removed 80% of the judges, teachers and officials for their Nazi collaboration. So if you collaborated with the Nazis in communist East Germany, you were out. So they imprisoned thousands, they executed 600 Nazi party leaders for war crimes, and they would have shot more of the war criminals had not so many fled to the protective embrace of the West. So he literally says East German Nazi collaborators ran to the West because the communists were taking no prisoners. Communists were being pretty fucking brutal. And he says how, yeah, we had the Nuremberg trials when they put the highest ranking Nazis who happened to survive the war on trial. But the bureaucrats, the administrators, scientists, those kind of people, they all got away with it, and they kept their jobs because Nazism equates too well, translates too well into capitalism. So that was quite interesting about the rise of fascism and the rise of Nazism and how interlinked it was with capitalism. So then he goes on to talk about revolution and how everyone seems to focus on kind of workers' violence. So when workers rise up and they're violent, and when groups rise up and they happen to be violent and they riot, everyone talks about that. So, case in point, the Black Lives Matter protests. Everybody points out, everybody on the right, or right at a certain point on the political spectrum, will point out they were violent, they looted, they attacked police. And he says here, by focusing on the violent rebellions of the downtrodden, we overlook the much greater repressive force and violence utilised by the ruling oligarchs to maintain the status quo, including armed attacks against peaceful demonstrations, mass arrests, torture, destruction of opposition organisations, suppression of dissident publications, death squad assassinations, the extermination of whole villages and the like. So he's like, these people are violent. Capitalists are institutionally violent. They will send death squads to your house. If you have a publication, they will squash you. If you have a peaceful demonstration, they will bring out the hoses and the dogs and they will crush that. They have mass arrests. They torture. They are inherently violent, but when people fight back, everyone looks at that. So it also says revolutions in Russia, China, Vietnam and El Salvador all began peacefully. So, with crowds of peasants and workers launching non-violent protests only to be met with violent oppression from the authorities. So this is all very interesting stuff. He also goes on and he talks about, this was quite interesting, I never knew this. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was a fiasco. Not because of insufficient air coverage, but because the Cuban people closed ranks behind their government and threw back the invaders. So here the argument is, well, if the Cuban government was so brutal and so oppressive, when the Americans came during the Bay of Pigs, why did they not get behind the Americans and overthrow their government? The Americans claim it was lack of air support, lack of air coverage that caused the Bay of Pigs to go so wrong, but it was actually the people getting behind their government and fighting back against the Americans. And then he says here, look, US Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge admitted the only people who have been doing anything for little man to lift him up have been the communists. So right there in black and white, it's from a US ambassador. Communists are backing people up, backing up the little man. And then he points out how a lot of the criticisms of communist regimes, a lot of the things that they're accused of denying people, those people never had anyway. So, for instance, the Chinese Revolution did not crush democracy. There was none to crush in that oppressively feudal regime, obviously before the revolution. The Cuban Revolution did not destroy freedom. It destroyed a hateful US-sponsored police state. So there was no freedom to destroy. The Algerian Revolution did not abolish national liberties. Precious few existed under French colonialism. The Vietnamese revolutions did not abrogate individual rights. No such rights were available under the US-supported puppet governments of Bao Dai, Diem and Cai. So all of these things that communists are accused of denying their subjects, of denying the people, they never had before. So, and then he talks about the benefits of the Cuban Revolution in particular. So for all its mistakes and abuses, the Cuban Revolution brought sanitations, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing and human services to a level not found throughout most of the Third World and in many parts of the First World. So he's saying even parts of the First World didn't have it as good as the Cubans had it in terms of sanitation, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing. Infant mortality in Cuba has dropped from 60 per thousand in 1960 to 9.7 per thousand in 1991, while life expectancy rose from 55 to 75 during the same period. Smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, typhoid, polio and numerous other diseases have been wiped out by improved living standards and public health programs. Cuba has enjoyed a level of literacy higher than that in the United States. So more Cubans can read and write than Americans, and a life expectancy that compares well with advanced industrial nations. And then he quotes Castro himself, who said, "We had 25,000 third world students studying on scholarships. Our country has treated more children who were victims of the Chernobyl tragedy than all other countries combined. The country with the most doctors per capita of all countries, that's one for every 214 inhabitants. The country with most art instructors per capita of all countries in the world. The country with the most sport instructors in the world." That gives you an idea of the effort involved. The country where life expectancy is more than 75 years. So Castro just outlining there why the Americans hate him and hate the achievements of his regime. And he just goes on and on. This is really worth a read, guys. It really is. If you're even remotely interested in communism, this is definitely a bit of a rebuff to the stuff you learn in schools about communism, about how it's brutal, how it's oppressive. And this struck me quite a bit as well. He talks about how that even on the left, in Western academia, so-called leftists, he said Ronald Radosh urged that the peace movement purge itself of communists so that it not be accused of being communist. If I understand Radosh, to save ourselves from anti-communist witch hunts, we should ourselves become witch hunters. So in order to stop ourselves being accused of being communists, we need to get rid of actual communists. So it's like, and many of the left have failed to realise that those who fight for social change on behalf of the less privileged elements of society will be red-baited by conservative elites, whether they're communists or not. Again, Keir Starmer is popping out at me here. In the 3 decades after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets made industrial advances equal to what capitalism took a century to accomplish. So think about that for a moment. It took them 30 years to industrialise. Bear in mind, the USSR or Russia before the revolution was 99% agricultural. In 30 years, they industrialised that shit. And it took the capitalist world 100 years to do that, while feeding and schooling their children. So the kids of the Soviet Union were being fed and schooled and not put to work 14 hours a day as the capitalist industrialists did and still do in many parts of the world, particularly in third world countries. Going back to the US leftists and the Western leftists, most US leftists have practiced a left McCarthyism. See, there's that term I said that he coined, against people who did have something positive to say about existing communism, excluding them from participation in conferences, advisory boards, political endorsement and left publications. Once again, Keir Starmer and Labour Party in 2021 is popping out the pages here. It really definitely worth a read, guys. I've highlighted so much here. I appreciate this video. It's gone on for quite a while. In 1918 to 2014, capitalist nations, including the United States, invaded Soviet Russia in a bloody but unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the revolutionary Bolshevik government. So if people rise up, if workers rise up and overthrow a capitalist government or a feudal government, then they will turn around and do a counter-revolution and try and get you out. So from the off, you're going to be besieged. Just going to go on a bit more here. Here we go. Yeah, so we talked about the downfall of communism. The overthrow of communism gave the green light to the unbridled exploitative impulses of Western corporate interests, no longer needing to convince workers that they live better than their counterparts in Russia, and no longer restrained by a competing system. The corporate class is rolling back the many gains that working people in the West have won over the years. So obviously when there was communism, there was this kind of red fear, and it sort of touches on a bit of a benefit of that fear is that Western capitalist countries gave their workers a little bit more because they had to convince their people that you're living better than the communists. But obviously since communism has now fallen, they can kind of roll that back a bit. So definitely worth a read. I could go on for all day long. All day long, I really could. He talks about Stalin. Even Stalin gets a bit of a rewash here. He talks about how Stalin did some bad things, but not nearly as bad as is claimed. Particularly the chapter 5, Stalin's Fingers, where he claims that Churchill allegedly once met with Stalin and asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. Stalin went like this. And this, of course, could be body language for, I don't want to broach that subject, but Churchill took this to mean 10 million people. And that's something that he didn't ask for clarification on, he didn't ask any follow-up questions. And that is something that scholars are quoting to this day, 10 million. And it's just absurd how that is claimed to be evidence, even though nobody knows, the only person who knows why he did this was Stalin himself, and Stalin's been dead for 70 years. So this was quite interesting. See, during the upheavals and the downfall of the USSR, Polish Solidarity, which is the organisation, overthrew the communist government without breaking a single window. So the point being made here is, if communists are so violent, so oppressive, why did they not fight back? When communism was overthrown, they didn't break a single window in Poland. This says at least as much about the government that was overthrown as about the rebels. So obviously the West is going to try and paint it as that was a peaceful revolution, but the apparently oppressive, brutal dictatorship communists didn't fight back, which is rather bizarre. Bizarre. I invented a new word. So it says the relatively peaceful transition does not fit our image of unscrupulous totalitarians who stop at nothing to maintain power over captive populations. Why didn't the ruthless Reds act more ruthlessly? So exactly what I just said. This was quite interesting. Talks about Stalin again and about his the Gulag deaths. So he says more than half of all Gulag deaths for the 1934 to 53 period occurred during the war years 1941 to 45, mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the lot of the entire Soviet population. In 1944, for instance, the labour camp death rate was 92 per thousand. By 1953, with the post-war recovery, camp deaths had declined to 3 per thousand. And then he says the vast majority of inmates were charged with non-political offences, so murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable in any society. Total executions from 1921 to 53, a 33-year span inclusive, was 799,455. No breakdown of this figure was provided by researchers. It includes those who were guilty of non-political capital crimes, as well as those who collaborated in the Western capitalist invasion and subsequent White Guard army atrocities. It also includes some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and probably German SS prisoners. Well, there you go. So, during Stalin's so-called reign of terror, the 800,000 nearly people that he had executed, there's no breakdown. We don't know how many people were political prisoners and how many were just regular criminals, Nazi sympathisers, Nazi collaborators. And then this I thought was quite interesting. When the communist states were overthrown, where were the half-starved hordes, pouring out of internment camps with their tales of travail? So we've all seen pictures of German concentration camps and labour camps, prisoners being released and they're half-starved, they're emaciated, and they come out and they tell you what happened in those camps. Where were the people coming out of the gulags? Where were they when communism fell? Where were all the people pouring out of the gulags telling us it was horrendous and this is what happened? What of the supposedly vast numbers of political prisoners said to exist in the other communist totalitarian police states of Eastern Europe? Why no evidence of their mass release in post-communist era? And where are the mass of political prisoners in Cuba? So again, where are they? If this was the case, if people were just being locked up for criticising the government to that degree that we're told by the West, where are they? This was quite interesting, actually. In 1995, Miroslav Stefan, the former secretary of the Prague Communist Party, was sentenced to 2.5 years for ordering Czech police to use tear gas and water cannons against demonstrators in 1988. Is this the best example of bloodthirsty red oppression that the capitalist restorationists in Czechoslovakia could find? An action that does not even qualify as a crime in most Western nations. So in most Western nations, we have tear gas, we have, riot control, and this was Miroslav Stefan is used as kind of this example of how communism crushes political dissidents, and it's just like, this is the best you've got. So during the years of Stalin's reign, the Soviet Union made dramatic gains in literacy, industrial wages, healthcare, and women's rights. Again, where's the oppression here? Again, yes, Stalin did some bad things. He wasn't perfect like any leader, but his achievements are being downplayed. In Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba, revolutionary communism created a life for the mass of people that was far better than the wretched existence they had endured under feudal lords, military bosses, foreign colonisers, and Western capitalists. I could go on, and I could go on, and I could go on. Just pick it up and read it, guys. It cost me £10 to get this. Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. I think this has been my longest book review yet. Definitely 10 out of 10. Give it a read. 125% brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. It will really make you question everything you've been told about Stalin, about the Soviets, about the communists, about the USSR. Read it. Please read it. If you've got any interest, even if you're not a communist, if you've just got an interest in the era, interest in the political theory, read it. Michael Parenti just dissects and analyses and pulls apart all of the Western propaganda. Definitely give it a read, guys.